The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of a ticking clock somewhere above. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and every eye in the room was fixed on Clint Eastwood as he stood tall in the defendant's chair. The media's cameras flashed incessantly, casting sharp white light against the grim faces of the jury. The world watched. The world waited. Clint, the man who had built an empire with his rugged, no-nonsense persona on the big screen, had never faced anything like this before. It wasn't a villain from a western or a fight scene that tested his mettle today. No, this was far worse. He wasn't in the comfort of his Hollywood sets. He was in a courtroom, under the harsh glare of public scrutiny, and his entire legacy was on trial. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man in his mid-40s, stood across from him. His eyes were cold, calculating. He cleared his throat, and the words that followed hit Clint like a punch to the gut. "Mr. Eastwood, you stand before this court today accused of being a fraud. The world knows you as a Hollywood legend, a man who has built his career on your so-called true stories of bravery, espionage, and heroism. But the truth, Mr. Eastwood, is that these stories are fabrications. Your alleged CIA involvement is nothing more than a lie, a carefully crafted myth to elevate your image." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Murmurs of disbelief bounced off the walls. Clint's jaw tightened, but his expression remained unfazed. He wasn't sure if it was the years of playing tough characters or his unshakable sense of self, but he wasn't about to let this accusation break him. But it hurt. Not because it was untrue. No, Clint had come to terms with his past a long time ago, but because this wasn't just an attack on him. This was an assault on everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to protect. The public's perception of him was being shattered before his very eyes. The prosecutor, sensing the shift in the room, continued, his voice gaining momentum. "Mr. Eastwood, your reputation, your identity, your very legacy, all built on a foundation of lies. You are no different from the frauds you've played on screen. The very CIA missions you claim to have been involved in, there is no evidence to support them. The documents don't exist. Your medals? Fabricated. The men who served with you? Not a single one can vouch for your story." Clint's mind began to race. His thoughts were a blur, but one thing stood out. Why? Who was behind this? Who would go to such lengths to destroy a man's life? His career? His reputation? The questions buzzed around him like a swarm of bees. There was a time when Clint Eastwood, the man, the actor, the director, had been unbreakable. He had walked into studios with his head held high, a man of power and respect. And now here he was, accused of being a fraud, a mere shadow of the persona he had crafted over decades. This is just another script, Clint thought bitterly, but this time, I'm not in control of the ending. He glanced over at the gallery, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the jury. They were all watching him, some with judgment in their eyes, others with disbelief. But one face stood out, lurking in the corner of the room. A man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. Clint's heart skipped a beat. The man didn't belong in a courtroom. He belonged in a world Clint knew too well, one where shadows moved in the background, unseen by the public eye. The man's cold eyes met Clint's for a brief moment. A shiver ran down Clint's spine. He recognized him. It was an old contact from his CIA days. Clint's world, the one he had carefully built, began to crack. This wasn't just a public smear campaign. This wasn't just about some legal battle. The pieces started to fall into place. Someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Someone who didn't want Clint's past to remain hidden any longer. The prosecutor turned to the jury, his voice rising in an attempt to seal Clint's fate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the facts. The man before you is not a hero. He is not the brave CIA agent he claims to be. He is a fraud, a man who used his fame to cover up the truth of his past." Clint's pulse quickened. The words felt like daggers in his chest. This wasn't just about his career as an actor. This was something deeper, something darker. There was a conspiracy at play, and it involved far more than the courtroom. But what? Who had set him up? And why? The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people exchanged glances, some nodding, others shaking their heads. The media buzzed, capturing every moment. Clint's name was being dragged through the mud, and yet he felt strangely detached. He had survived wars, had faced death countless times in the field, and had stared down enemies more terrifying than this. But this was a war for his soul, and it was a fight he wasn't sure he could win. He stood up, his movements slow, deliberate. The eyes of the world were on him. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was his life. Clint took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't about to let anyone control the narrative of his life. Not the prosecutor, not the media, not even the shadows in the corners of the room. There was something they didn't know. There was something they couldn't possibly understand. "Your Honor," Clint said, his voice calm but carrying an unspoken weight. "I'm not here to explain my past to anyone. I don't owe anyone that. But let me make one thing clear. What you're accusing me of is a lie. And I'll prove it." The words were simple, but they hung in the air like a challenge. As Clint sat back down, his eyes once again locked with the man in the shadows. The real game had begun, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let anyone pull the strings any longer. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood was a man forged by fire. The fire of adversity, the fire of a world that never cared for him, and the fire of his own unrelenting will. From a small town in California to the towering heights of Hollywood, Clint's life was a series of tests, each one more grueling than the last. His journey to becoming a legend wasn't one of overnight success. It was the story of a man who had learned, the hard way, that in order to survive, you had to become something no one could break. Born in 1930 in San Francisco, Clint was raised in a modest household. His parents, Ruth and Clinton Eastwood Sr., were hardworking people, doing their best to make ends meet during the Great Depression. They weren't rich, but they instilled in Clint a deep sense of responsibility and a fierce independence that would shape his future. He wasn't the most popular kid in school, nor the most athletic, but he had a quiet confidence that others found intimidating. At a young age, Clint became accustomed to the idea that the world wasn't going to hand him anything. If he wanted something, he had to fight for it. That philosophy stuck with him through his childhood, and it would continue to serve him as he entered the world of Hollywood. Clint's early years in the film industry were far from glamorous. His first real break came in the late 1950s, with a role on the TV show Rawhide. But it wasn't until 1964 that Clint truly began to carve out his place in Hollywood with his iconic portrayal of the man with no name in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. The role catapulted him into international fame, but it wasn't just his acting that set him apart, it was his presence. Clint didn't just act in his roles. He became them. His tough exterior, deep voice, and unwavering gaze made him a symbol of masculinity and stoic resilience. But the public persona Clint had built was only part of the story. Beneath the hardened exterior, he was a man shaped by deep personal struggles. His childhood had been marked by frequent moves and a sense of instability. As a teenager, Clint battled a sense of isolation that only worsened as his fame grew. He became known as a man of few words, someone who was hard to get to know. But those closest to him knew better. Clint was driven by a need for purpose, a need for something that transcended the silver screen. His early adult life was riddled with failure. He had a string of failed relationships, a marriage that ended in divorce, and was often criticized for his detached, sometimes cold, persona. But Clint didn't let those criticisms define him. Instead, he turned to something even darker, something that no one knew about, something that would shape the rest of his life. In the mid-1960s, when Clint was still riding high on his success, he was approached by someone he'd never expected, the CIA. They had seen something in him that the public hadn't, the raw instincts of a soldier, a man capable of adapting to any environment, no matter how dangerous. The offer was simple: help the government in covert missions, using his fame as a cover. The rest of the world would never know. Clint was reluctant at first. He had always been a man who liked to keep his personal life private, but the chance to serve his country in a way few people ever would was too tempting. He agreed, and his life took an unexpected turn. For years, Clint worked undercover on secret assignments for the CIA, traveling the world under false identities. He'd infiltrated enemy lines, sabotaged military operations, and gathered intelligence on key figures in the global conflict. He had seen things no one could ever imagine, and done things that still haunted him. But as the years wore on, Clint found himself growing more and more disillusioned with the world of espionage. The lies, the manipulation, the constant threat of death. It was a world that consumed him, and one that he was desperate to escape. Despite the toll it took on him, Clint's covert work never interfered with his public persona. Hollywood remained his home, and his secret life remained just that, a secret. But deep down, Clint knew that the man the world saw was only a fraction of who he truly was. In the mid-1970s, after years of working in the shadows, Clint made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He walked away from the CIA. But the world of espionage doesn't let you go so easily, and Clint soon found himself caught up in a new wave of covert operations. This time, though, he was no longer working for the government. He was working for himself. Clint's career in Hollywood continued to soar, with films like Dirty Harry, Unforgiven, and Million Dollar Baby, each one cementing his place as one of the greatest filmmakers and actors of his time. He had found a kind of peace in his work, channeling his own inner turmoil into his characters. But no matter how successful he became, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that there were people out there who still knew him for who he really was. His marriage to actress Dina Ruiz in 1996 brought him a semblance of happiness, but even that relationship was not without its struggles. Clint's past was always lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface in ways he couldn't predict. As the years passed, Clint's life began to slow down. He focused more on his directing career, becoming a legend in his own right, creating films that would resonate with audiences for generations. But even as he stood behind the camera, Clint was still haunted by the shadows of his past. Now, in the courtroom, it all came crashing back. His past, his secrets, his lies, they were all laid bare, and the world was ready to judge him. But Clint had never been one to back down from a challenge. He had faced the worst of humanity during his covert operations, and he wasn't about to let anyone take away his reputation. He sat quietly in the courtroom, the weight of his past pressing down on him. But there was something else there too, a sense of resolve. The man before the jury, the man they thought they knew, wasn't the full picture. There was more to Clint Eastwood than they could ever understand, and he was ready to show them just how deep the rabbit hole went. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Clint Eastwood sat motionless in his seat. His mind was racing, yet outwardly he appeared calm, perhaps even detached. The prosecutor's words still echoed in his head. A fraud. The accusation felt as sharp as a blade, and despite his best efforts to remain stoic, Clint couldn't suppress the tightening in his chest. For the first time in years, his reputation, something he had worked so tirelessly to build, was under siege. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy was already well underway. News outlets were running the story nonstop, dissecting every detail of Clint's life, picking apart his film career, his personal history, and even his military service. Social media exploded, with hashtags like #ClintIsAFraud trending worldwide. His name, once synonymous with strength and integrity, was now being dragged through the mud. I never asked for this, Clint thought bitterly as he scanned the room. His once iconic, unwavering gaze now seemed to falter as his past, the one he had carefully crafted, was being torn apart by forces beyond his control. The prosecutor, however, wasn't done. He stood tall, his voice filled with confidence as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor began, "you've heard the claims, you've seen the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. Clint Eastwood's so-called CIA missions, his supposed acts of heroism, are nothing but a carefully orchestrated lie. We have no records, no documents, and no living witnesses to corroborate his story." Clint's eyes narrowed. This was personal now. They weren't just attacking his career, they were digging into the deepest, most secret parts of his life. "Mr. Eastwood's story is a carefully crafted myth," the prosecutor continued, turning to the jury with a self-satisfied smile. "He has used the power of Hollywood and his fame to manipulate the public into believing he was some kind of war hero, a man who had been involved in covert CIA operations around the world. But in reality, He was never more than an actor playing a role. It's time to expose the truth. The words stung, and Clint felt the weight of them like a physical blow. But he refused to let them see him break. He had been in worse situations before. A courtroom might not have been a battlefield, but it sure felt like one. The difference here was that the stakes were personal. This wasn't about defeating some on-screen villain. This was about defending his very existence. The prosecutor's voice rang out again, sharp and relentless. We have here a man who has lied to the world, who has deceived the public, and now, it's time to hold him accountable for those lies. Clint stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't going to let this moment slip by without a fight. As he rose to his feet, he felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He didn't glance at the jury, nor did he acknowledge the prosecutor. Instead, his gaze locked on the one man in the room who had been a constant presence during the trial, the man in the dark suit. The one whose cold, emotionless eyes had followed Clint's every move since the trial began. Clint knew him, though he wished he didn't. The man was a ghost from Clint's past, someone Clint hadn't seen in years. His name was Agent James Corbin, a former CIA operative who had worked alongside Clint during the darkest days of his covert missions. Corbin had always been an enigma, a man whose motives were never clear, whose loyalties seemed as fluid as the shadows they both operated in. Clint didn't trust Corbin, not then and certainly not now. But there was one thing Clint knew for certain. Corbin knew more about Clint's life than anyone else. He knew the truth behind Clint's CIA involvement, and if he chose to speak up, it could end Clint's career in an instant. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker. The whispers of the audience became louder, more pronounced. Clint could feel the weight of their judgment, but he didn't care. He had faced far worse in his life and emerged victorious. Today would be no different. Clint cleared his throat, his voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. "You're wrong," he said simply. His words were like a challenge, an accusation in and of themselves. The prosecutor paused, his smug smile faltering for a brief moment. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood?" Clint didn't flinch. "I said you're wrong. Everything you're accusing me of is based on lies. The truth will come out, and when it does, you'll regret underestimating me." There was an air of finality in his voice that sent a ripple through the room. The jury leaned forward, intrigued by the confidence Clint exuded. But the prosecutor was not deterred. "Mr. Eastwood, you can't hide behind bravado. You've been caught. There's no escaping the truth." Clint stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the prosecutor's. "You think you know the truth, but you're wrong about that, too. You have no idea what's been hidden in the shadows. But I'm done hiding. I'll show you the truth." The words hung in the air, but Clint wasn't done. He knew the next step wasn't about defending himself against accusations. It was about exposing the people behind this smear campaign. The truth was out there, but it was far darker and more complicated than anyone in that courtroom could imagine. Agent Corbin's face remained emotionless, his eyes cold, but Clint saw something there. Fear? Maybe. Guilt? Hard to say. Clint didn't know how deep Corbin was involved in all of this, but Clint was certain of one thing. If he wanted to survive this, he would need to confront the man in the shadows. The prosecutor's face twisted with frustration as Clint turned his back and returned to his seat. He wasn't ready to reveal everything yet, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Clint had learned to play the long game during his years as a CIA operative, and he wasn't about to lose now. The room settled into an eerie quiet, as if everyone could feel the storm brewing. Clint sat in the cold, sterile silence of his lawyer's office, staring out of the window. The bustling city outside was a stark contrast to the storm raging in his mind. The weight of the courtroom and the accusations against him still clung to him like a heavy cloak. But something inside Clint had shifted. He could no longer hide in the shadows. It was time to expose the truth, no matter what it took. His lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Pierce, was going through the case files, her pen moving quickly as she marked certain sections. She was good at what she did, probably the best, but even she seemed uneasy in the face of what Clint had just revealed in the courtroom. "Clint," Evelyn said quietly, her voice laced with concern, "I know you're trying to fight back, but this isn't just a case of slander. They're accusing you of something far bigger. If you're going to turn this around, we need hard evidence. Clint's jaw clenched and his eyes hardened. I've got something better than evidence, Evelyn. I've got the truth. And the truth is far more dangerous than anything they could have imagined. Evelyn paused, her pen hovering over the page. I've worked with you long enough to know there's more to this story than meets the eye. But exposing it, it's going to cost you, Clint. Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. He was no stranger to cost. In fact, he had learned the hard way that every victory in life, every moment of success, came with a price. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about the people he had trusted, the life he had built, and the legacy he was determined to protect. I've already paid the price, Clint said, his voice low and gravelly. And now it's time to make sure no one else has to. Evelyn didn't push further. She had known Clint long enough to understand that once he made up his mind, nothing would change it. Instead, she nodded, gathering the case files. All right, but we need to get to the root of this. Every piece of the puzzle, no matter how small. Who is behind this? Who's trying to destroy you? Clint didn't hesitate. James Corbin. Evelyn's eyes widened. She knew the name. Corbin had a reputation that even someone like her couldn't ignore. He was a ghost in the world of intelligence. Never quite on the record, never quite official. His name had floated through Clint's past like a shadow, and every time Clint tried to forget about him, Corbin would find a way back into his life. Corbin? Evelyn repeated, skepticism in her voice. You think he's behind all of this? But why? What could he possibly gain by exposing your past? Clint's gaze hardened, and he stood up, walking over to the window as though trying to escape the memories. Corbin has always been a man of ambition. He never liked the way I did things in the field. He wanted control, and when I walked away from the CIA, he lost his grip. He's been trying to get me back into the fold ever since. Evelyn crossed her arms, processing this. So, you think Corbin is trying to force you out of hiding, force you to go back to the CIA? Clint turned to face her, his eyes fierce. I don't just think it, Evelyn. I know it. And now he's using this trial to destroy me. If they can prove I'm a fraud, it'll ruin any credibility I have left. I'll be branded a liar, a charlatan, and that'll be the end of my career. But it won't just stop there. The CIA will own me again. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, considering the weight of Clint's words. She had worked with enough high-profile cases to understand that Clint wasn't the type of man to exaggerate. She also knew that exposing Corbin could lead to dangers far beyond the courtroom. But Clint's resolve was unwavering, and she knew she had no choice but to help him uncover the truth. We need to find out what Corbin is really up to, Evelyn said, her voice firm. This isn't just about clearing your name anymore. This is about stopping whatever game he's playing. Clint nodded slowly, the plans forming in his mind. I'll get to him. I know how to find him. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and research. Evelyn reached out to contacts in the intelligence community, using her connections to uncover any information about Corbin's recent activities. Clint, meanwhile, began to dig through his own past. His old CIA contacts, his declassified operations, and even the people he had crossed paths with during his covert missions. He knew the deeper they went, the more dangerous it would become, but Clint was no stranger to danger. As the investigation progressed, the pieces began to fall into place. There were whispers of Corbin's involvement in shadowy dealings, arms trafficking, international espionage, and even a few high-profile assassinations. But what stood out most was the fact that Corbin had been working with a private organization, one that had ties to the highest echelons of power in the government. And it was clear that Corbin wasn't just trying to take Clint down. He was using Clint's past to cover up something much bigger, something far more sinister. Clint's instincts told him that they were getting closer to the heart of the conspiracy. But as the walls closed in, so did the danger. The closer he got to the truth, the more obstacles seemed to appear. People who had once been his allies were now turning their backs on him, and those who had nothing to lose were more than willing to betray him for a quick paycheck. But Clint didn't flinch. He had been to hell and back more times than he cared to count. He had survived things that would break most men. And now, he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The quiet hum of the office seemed almost deafening as Clint sat in the dim light of the conference room, the tension in the air thickening. His heart raced in his chest, a mixture of anger, fear, and something more elusive, betrayal. He had been digging deeper into the conspiracy for days, piecing together fragments of information that didn't quite make sense. But now, standing before him was the final piece of the puzzle, one he hadn't expected to find. Evelyn sat across from him, her face pale as she handed him a folder. Her hands were shaking slightly, a clear indication of how grave the situation had become. "Clint," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern, This is bigger than I thought. I don't know how to say this, but I think Corbin's not just trying to destroy your reputation. I think he's been playing a much bigger game." Clint opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. There were classified CIA files, cryptic reports, and a series of names, some of which Clint recognized, others he didn't. But it wasn't the names that caught his attention. It was the final report, the one marked with a large, bold stamp, Top Secret. It was a memo about an operation, one that had been scrapped nearly 2 decades ago, but the details were chilling. Operation Cerberus. The memo described a covert CIA mission, one that Clint had been part of, but what shocked him was the twist. The mission, as it turned out, hadn't been about espionage or foreign threats. It had been about eliminating a potential whistleblower within the agency. And the person they were supposed to silence? Clint Eastwood. Clint's breath caught in his throat. The shock of it hit him like a freight train. All these years, he had believed that he had left the CIA behind, that his mission had ended when he walked away from the agency. But now, it was clear. He had never truly left. The file was damning. It revealed that Corbin, his former colleague and longtime rival, had been directly involved in orchestrating the operation to silence Clint. The very man Clint had trusted to watch his back had been the one to push him to the brink of destruction, all in the name of self-preservation. Evelyn's voice trembled as she broke the silence. "Clint, I don't think Corbin ever wanted to bring you back into the fold. I think he wants to erase you entirely. This operation was supposed to eliminate you as a threat, but you survived, and that's why he's trying to destroy everything you've built. Your career, your reputation, everything." Clint's mind raced as the pieces of the past started to fall into place. The shady deals, the lies, the whispers in the dark, it was all connected. Corbin had never forgiven Clint for walking away from the CIA. But what did Corbin gain by tearing Clint down now? The answer hit Clint like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about control. Corbin had been trying to cover up a far darker secret, one that, if exposed, would bring down the entire agency. And Clint, with his knowledge and his experience, was the only person standing in his way. Clint's fists clenched at his sides. The anger surged within him, burning hot and fast. For years, he had kept his distance from the CIA, choosing to live a life free of the shadows that had once consumed him. But now, it was clear, those shadows had never left. They had been lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, that moment had arrived. "This isn't just about me, is it?" Clint's voice was low, barely a whisper, but there was steel in it. Corbin's covering up something bigger, something that could destroy the CIA itself. Evelyn nodded grimly. "Yes, whatever it is, it's something so dangerous that Corbin is willing to go to any lengths to keep it hidden. And now, Clint, you're not just fighting for your life. You're fighting for the truth." The truth. It felt like a distant memory now, something he had been chasing for so long but had never quite been able to grasp. But now, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stop now. Clint stood, his legs shaking slightly from the weight of what he had just learned. "We have to go to the press," he said suddenly. "We expose everything. The CIA, Corbin, Operation Cerberus. The world has to know." Evelyn looked at him, her expression conflicted. "Are you sure, Clint? If you go public with this, it won't just end with a court case. This could bring the entire agency down, and you'll be right in the middle of it." Clint met her gaze with a fierce determination. "I've lived in the shadows long enough. It's time the truth came to light. If Corbin wants a war, then I'll give him one. but I won't do it alone. I'll fight for everything I've built, my career, my honor, and the people who have trusted me." Evelyn exhaled, her face softening slightly. "Then let's do it. But be ready, Clint. Once you start this, there's no going back." Clint nodded grimly. "I've never been afraid of the consequences. Not when it mattered." With that, he turned, his resolve unshakable. The fight was far from over, but now Clint knew what needed to be done. The truth would be his weapon, and nothing, no one, could stop him from revealing it. The silence of Clint's apartment was almost suffocating, the kind that comes after a storm has passed, but before you fully understand the damage it's left behind. The world outside moved on, unaware of the battles being waged in hidden corners, but Clint knew that everything had changed. He had made the decision. He was going to expose Corbin, the CIA, and the corrupt forces at play, no matter the consequences. But as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the piles of evidence in front of him, the weight of the truth began to sink in. The decision wasn't just about clearing his name or getting back at Corbin. It was about a system that had once shaped him but had now betrayed everything he stood for. It was about revealing the lies and corruption that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Evelyn had been a constant presence in these last few days, providing advice, helping him navigate the complexities of the case, and making sure he didn't do anything rash. But even she had started to show signs of strain. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous things became. And Clint could feel it too. The walls were closing in, but he had no other choice now. The phone on the table buzzed, breaking his thoughts. Clint glanced down at the screen. Evelyn's name flashed across it. He picked it up. "Clint, it's happening," Evelyn's voice came through, urgent and breathless. "Corbin's making his move. They're closing in on you." Clint's heart skipped a beat, but his voice remained steady. "What do you mean? What's happening?" "I just got off the phone with one of my sources," she said. "Corbin's already gone public with the information he has about you. He's turning the media against you, making it look like you're the one who's been covering up the truth. You're being framed." Clint slammed his fist on the table, frustration bubbling to the surface. "He's trying to bury me again. He'll stop at nothing to make me the villain." "Clint, this isn't just about your reputation anymore. This is about your life. They've already started planting false information in the press. If you want to fight back, you need to act fast." Clint stood up, pacing the room, thinking hard. This was the moment he had been dreading, but he knew it was coming. The truth had to be exposed, but the clock was ticking. Corbin was already one step ahead, manipulating the narrative and pushing the agenda. But Clint wasn't going to let him win. He would fight fire with fire. "Tell me what we need to do," Clint said, his voice a low growl. "We need to get ahead of the story, Clint. You can't just sit back and hope people will see the truth. You need to go public, but you can't do it alone. I've reached out to some trusted journalists who can help. It's time to take the fight directly to Corbin." Clint took a deep breath, weighing the risks. He had always been a lone wolf, but this was different. This was bigger than just him. This was about exposing the corruption that had haunted him for far too long. "All right," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "Let's do it. I'm ready." The next few hours were a blur. Clint and Evelyn worked tirelessly, contacting trusted sources and preparing the documents they needed to bring to the press. Everything they had uncovered. The truth about Corbin, Operation Cerberus, the conspiracy within the CIA, was laid out in black and white. It wasn't just a fight for his name anymore. It was a fight for justice, for exposing the darkness that had lingered in the shadows for far too long. As they prepared for the press conference, Clint stood in front of the mirror, taking one last look at himself. His reflection stared back, the man who had been to hell and back, who had fought against impossible odds. But now, it wasn't just about survival. It was about something greater. It was about facing the truth, no matter the cost. When Clint finally stepped into the press room, the cameras clicked, the microphones were raised, and the world was watching. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the sea of journalists and cameras. This was it, the moment that would define everything. He walked up to the podium, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The room fell silent as Clint cleared his throat. "I'm Clint Eastwood," he began, his voice strong and unwavering. "And I'm here to tell you the truth. For years, I've been living under a cloud of lies, manipulated by a system that I once served. But today, I'm taking back control. I'm exposing the corruption that's been festering in the shadows for too long. What you've heard about me, what Corbin has told you, it's all a lie. The truth is far darker than he's letting you believe." The room was still as Clint continued. "I was part of a covert CIA operation, one that was supposed to silence me. They wanted me to disappear because I refused to be part of their twisted plans. They've tried to bury me, to make me into a fraud, but I will not be silenced. The truth is out there, and I'm here to make sure the world hears it." Clint paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. The reporters were on edge, their pens poised, waiting for the next bombshell. "The CIA," Clint said, his voice thick with emotion, "has been hiding the truth for decades. And Corbin? He's at the center of it all. The truth will come out, and when it does, the world will know who the real fraud is." As the room erupted in chaos, Clint knew that the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The truth had been set free, but now, the fight for justice would truly begin. The courtroom was a battlefield. The air crackled with tension as Clint Eastwood stood at the front, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the sea of reporters, lawyers, and dignitaries seated in front of him. This wasn't just any case. This wasn't just about a man trying to clear his name. This was the ultimate confrontation, the truth versus Corbin. And today, Clint was going to make sure the world knew who had been pulling the strings in the shadows. As Clint stood tall in front of the judge, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The press had covered the case from every angle, painting him as a hero and a villain all at once. But it wasn't about public perception anymore. It was about taking down the one man who had been behind the lies all along. Corbin had spent the last few weeks spinning his narrative, turning the media against Clint, painting him as a disgraced former CIA agent who had betrayed his country. He'd mobilized every resource at his disposal to discredit Clint and push forward a case that painted Clint as nothing more than a criminal. But Clint had something Corbin didn't: the truth. "Order in the court!" the judge's voice boomed, snapping Clint back to reality. He nodded, taking a deep breath, and turned toward the defense table, where Corbin sat, a smug expression plastered on his face. He was confident, but Clint knew that wasn't going to last much longer. This was their final showdown, and Clint was determined to come out on top. Clint's lawyer, Michael, a seasoned litigator who had been fighting tooth and nail for Clint's reputation, stood beside him, offering a reassuring nod. He knew the stakes. This was no longer just about Clint's future. It was about exposing the systemic corruption that had been festering for years, a fight Clint could no longer back down from. As Michael prepared to make his opening argument, Clint's mind raced. He thought of Evelyn, her tireless work behind the scenes to get the truth out there. Without her, none of this would have been possible. She had risked everything to help him, even if it meant putting her own career and safety on the line. He owed this fight to her as much as he owed it to himself. "Your Honor," Michael began, standing tall, "what we are here to discuss today is a matter of justice, of uncovering the truth behind a web of lies spun by none other than Corbin himself. My client, Mr. Clint Eastwood, has been falsely accused of actions that were never his. He is not the fraud the prosecution claims him to be. No, Your Honor, the fraud here is sitting across from us today." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Michael pointed toward Corbin. Clint could feel the tension spike, the eyes of the room turning toward Corbin, who was now looking a little less confident, though he still carried himself with an air of superiority. Corbin's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Frank, immediately rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice filled with venom. "This is baseless. These accusations are nothing but a desperate attempt to deflect attention from Mr. Eastwood's criminal activities. He has already admitted to his past. He was an agent for the CIA and left under questionable circumstances." The judge nodded, motioning for Frank to continue, but Clint knew the game was shifting. They were no longer playing by the rules. Corbin's lawyer was trying to paint Clint as the villain, but the truth was about to come out, and they weren't ready for it. Michael turned to Clint, his voice low but reassuring. "We're not here to play defense, Clint. We're here to expose the truth. All of it. Clint nodded, his fists tightening at his sides. This wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about bringing down the entire house of cards. Corbin had manipulated the system for years, using his position to erase people like Clint, people who had once served the agency with honor. But Clint was done being the pawn. It was time to fight back. After a brief recess, Michael called his first witness, Evelyn. Her testimony was crucial. She had been the one to uncover the documents that had tied Corbin directly to the conspiracy. She was the one who had risked everything to make sure Clint had the ammunition he needed to fight back. As Evelyn took the stand, the room grew quiet. She was calm, composed, and more determined than ever to see this through. Ms. Anderson, Michael began, his voice steady. Can you please describe for the court the evidence you uncovered that links Mr. Corbin to the fraudulent operation? Evelyn's eyes scanned the room, her gaze briefly meeting Clint's before she spoke. I discovered a series of documents, Your Honor, that detailed a covert CIA operation called Cerberus. This operation, which was never officially acknowledged, was designed to eliminate individuals who were seen as a threat to the agency's secret dealings. Clint Eastwood was one of the targets. The very man who has been accused of betraying the CIA was, in fact, a victim of its corruption. Gasps filled the courtroom. Even Corbin's smug expression faltered for a moment. Evelyn continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. These documents, which I have verified and presented to the court, also reveal that Corbin was directly involved in orchestrating this operation. He had a vested interest in making sure Clint Eastwood disappeared, and when he didn't, Corbin began his campaign to destroy Clint's life. Clint could see the shock on Corbin's face, his carefully constructed facade starting to crack. He had known this moment would come, but he never expected it to hit so hard. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Clint remained still, his gaze locked on Corbin. This was it. The truth was finally in the open, and there was no way Corbin could escape it now. The judge banged his gavel, silencing the room. Order. The court will hear the rest of the testimony in an orderly fashion. As the trial continued, Clint knew they were winning. The walls Corbin had carefully built around his lies were falling apart, and soon, the world would see the truth. This was his moment, the final showdown, and he was going to make sure Corbin paid for everything. The courtroom was electric with tension. Clint could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The culmination of years of being pursued, framed, and hunted was about to come to a head. It had been a long, grueling journey, but it was all leading up to this moment. The final piece of the puzzle was about to be revealed, and with it, the true nature of Corbin's betrayal. Clint could see the sweat on Corbin's brow as he tried to maintain his composure. The arrogant, smug look that had defined him for years was slipping away. Evelyn's testimony had already shaken him to his core, but Clint knew there was more to come. The final evidence was the key to bringing it all crashing down. Across the courtroom, Corbin's lawyer, Frank, was trying to keep things together. His fingers drummed nervously on the table as he whispered something to his client, but Clint could tell it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no way to stop it now. The judge cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the proceedings. Ms. Anderson, you may proceed with your next piece of evidence. Evelyn stood from the witness stand, her calm demeanor unwavering. She motioned for the court to view the projector screen behind her, where the image of a file folder appeared. It was a simple file, but Clint knew what was inside. This was the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that would tie Corbin directly to the conspiracy once and for all. Clint felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was short-lived. He could see Corbin's eyes widen in panic, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He had been confident, too confident, that this day would never come. But it was here, and there was no escaping it now. Evelyn's voice broke through the tension. This document is a declassified report from an internal investigation into Operation Cerberus. It outlines specific directives given by high-ranking officials, including Mr. Corbin, to carry out covert actions against CIA personnel they deemed expendable. Clint Eastwood was marked for elimination, and this document proves it. Clint could see Corbin's hand tremble as he reached for the glass of water in front of him, but his eyes remained locked on the screen. The document displayed detailed instructions, with Corbin's signature stamped at the bottom, confirming his involvement. The entire courtroom was silent as the full weight of the evidence settled over the room. Your Honor, Evelyn continued, this document, along with the testimonies we've presented, clearly demonstrate that Mr. Eastwood was not only wrongfully targeted but also framed for crimes he did not commit. The conspiracy that Corbin masterminded goes far beyond Mr. Eastwood's personal case. This is a systemic issue that involves countless lives, many of which were destroyed under Corbin's direction. A hushed gasp swept through the courtroom as Evelyn stepped back, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in. Clint could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. This was the fight he'd been waiting for, the moment where everything came crashing down. He had always known the truth, but now, the world would finally see it. Corbin's face had turned ashen, his once imposing demeanor cracking under the pressure. Frank, his lawyer, had no words. The evidence was irrefutable, and there was nothing they could do to spin this. It was over. Clint's heart pounded in his chest, but he remained steady. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for all those who had been silenced, erased, and forgotten by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The CIA's darkest secrets were now exposed for the world to see. As the judge took a moment to review the evidence, Clint turned his attention to the gallery of reporters watching intently. The flood of media attention had been relentless, but now it had reached its peak. His name was no longer associated with scandal or disgrace. No, Clint Eastwood was becoming the symbol of defiance against a corrupt system. He had become a voice for the voiceless. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. The evidence presented is, indeed, compelling. I hereby declare a recess as the court will deliberate on the ramifications of this case. Further actions will be taken against the parties involved in this conspiracy. Clint exhaled sharply, the weight lifting from his chest, but he knew this was far from over. This was just the beginning of a long, drawn-out process of exposing every corner of the corruption. But the first step had been taken. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back now. As Clint and Evelyn made their way out of the courtroom, Clint couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The betrayal that had haunted him for so long was finally exposed. It was a hard-earned victory, but it was only the beginning of what would be a long and tumultuous journey. Clint, we did it, Evelyn said, her voice soft but filled with pride. The world will finally see the truth. Clint nodded, but his thoughts were already racing ahead. This isn't over. Corbin won't go down without a fight. We need to stay focused. Evelyn gave him a reassuring smile. We will. But for now, let's take a moment. We've earned it. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Clint felt the eyes of the world on him, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of judgment. He felt free. The battle was far from over, but Clint Eastwood had proven one thing today. The truth, no matter how hidden, would always rise to the surface. And now, Corbin's reign of lies was coming to an end. The air was thick with uncertainty. While Clint had won the battle in the courtroom, he knew the war was far from over. The moment the verdict was announced, Corbin had stormed out of the courthouse, his eyes blazing with rage. He wasn't the type to let defeat simmer. No, Clint knew Corbin would strike back, and he'd strike hard. Clint stood in the lobby of his office building, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Evelyn was beside him, her eyes reflecting the same unease. They'd won the case, but it was clear that Corbin had far-reaching power that extended far beyond the courtroom. The media had been buzzing all day, but Clint could feel the calm before the storm. There was a sense of waiting, like a storm on the horizon that had yet to unleash. Clint, we did it, Evelyn said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. But you know Corbin won't take this lying down. We need to be prepared. He's going to come for us. Clint's lips tightened as he thought about what might be coming next. I know, and I'm not sure what he's got up his sleeve, but I can guarantee it won't be pretty. They had just wrapped up their celebratory moment, but in the back of Clint's mind, all he could think about was the next step. The system had failed him for so long, and Corbin had exploited every inch of its vulnerabilities. There was no way the fight was truly over until Corbin was behind bars, and Clint wouldn't rest until that day came. As Clint turned to head for his office, a call interrupted his thoughts. The number flashing on his phone was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that made Clint's gut churn. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cold, familiar, and dripping with malice. "Mr. Eastwood, I hope I'm not disturbing you," said Corbin, his voice laced with contempt. "I just wanted to congratulate you on your little courtroom victory. Too bad you're too naive to realize that this is far from over." Clint's grip on the phone tightened. "What are you talking about, Corbin?" "Oh, didn't you know? The game has just begun. You think this is all just about the CIA? You think winning this little case means you've won the war? Think again, Clint. I've got the resources to make your life a living hell, and I'll make sure you pay for what you've done." The line went dead, and Clint stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Corbin's words sinking in. He knew Corbin was dangerous, but hearing the venom in his voice reminded him just how far the man would go to protect his interests. The fight Clint had started wasn't just a personal one anymore. It was a war against an enemy who would stop at nothing to destroy him. Evelyn watched Clint closely, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "What did he say?" "He's not finished," Clint muttered, his voice grim. "He's going to come after us in ways we can't even predict. He's got connections, power, and people who owe him favors. This won't be over until he's destroyed every part of my life. And if we don't act fast, that could very well happen." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "So what's our move?" Clint exhaled slowly. "We go on the offensive. We need to find out who's still working for him, who's protecting him, and we need to get ahead of the game before he makes his next move. I don't care how deep we have to dig. We find out everything, and we use it against him." For the first time in a long time, Clint felt a surge of purpose. He wasn't just reacting to Corbin anymore. He was going to take the fight to him. They had the evidence. They had the truth. Now, it was time to use it. But Clint knew they couldn't do it alone. It was time to reach out to old contacts, people who could help them fight back. He needed someone who understood the depths of Corbin's operations, someone who had been on the inside. There was only one person Clint trusted with that kind of mission: Jesse Blake. Jesse had been Clint's partner during his years in the CIA, a man who had seen the worst of the agency's operations and lived to tell the tale. Jesse was sharp, resourceful, and ruthless when it came to getting things done. If anyone could help Clint take down Corbin, it was him. "Jesse's the only one who can help us now," Clint said to Evelyn, determination setting in his voice. "We're going to need to move fast, and we need him in our corner." Evelyn nodded. "Let's get to work then." While Clint and Evelyn scrambled to strategize, the darkness that had loomed over their victory was about to descend even faster than they anticipated. They hadn't accounted for Corbin's true power, his ability to strike from the shadows without leaving any trace. Corbin wasn't just a corrupt official. He was a man with a web of connections spanning the highest levels of government, military, and private enterprises. And with a single phone call, he could bring the world crashing down around Clint's team. Clint wasn't blind to the danger, but the reality of the situation hit harder now that Corbin had made his intentions clear. This was no longer a simple legal battle. It was a high-stakes war with life-or-death consequences. Corbin would not rest until Clint was destroyed, and Clint knew the same could be said for him. This wasn't just a fight for freedom. It was a fight for survival. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and planning. Clint and Evelyn managed to track down Jesse Blake, who, after some convincing, agreed to meet them. The man was as sharp as ever, and Clint knew they needed him more than ever. But Jesse's involvement wasn't without its risks. The more people they brought into this fight, the greater the chances that Corbin's reach would extend and ensnare them all. As they prepared to meet with Jesse in a dimly lit back alley cafe, Clint's thoughts were consumed with one thing: Corbin's next move. What would he do? How far was he willing to go to win? And most importantly, how much more of this battle could Clint endure before everything he'd worked for fell apart? Clint couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving too fast. The events had unfolded so quickly, courtroom victories, betrayals, and Corbin's threats, that it was hard to keep track of what was coming next. But he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't act fast, Corbin would drag them both back into the shadows from which they had just escaped. The alley behind the small cafe was dark, lit only by a single flickering street lamp. A soft drizzle had begun, making the pavement slick and reflecting the yellow light in uneven pools. Clint glanced at Evelyn as they approached, her eyes scanning the surroundings cautiously. She, too, understood the gravity of the situation. They weren't just meeting an old ally. They were making a dangerous move. Jesse Blake had been out of the game for years, but Clint knew that the moment Jesse walked back into his world, everything would change. The door to the cafe creaked open, and out stepped a familiar figure. Jesse Blake. He was older, grayer, but his sharp eyes still held the same intensity Clint remembered. He was the kind of man who had seen the worst the world could offer, and had the scars to prove it. "Clint," Jesse said, his voice low but firm. "Evelyn, it's been a long time." Clint gave a tight smile. "It's good to see you, Jesse. Glad you're still alive." Jesse chuckled, though it wasn't a laugh that reached his eyes. "You know me, Clint. I'm hard to kill." Evelyn folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "We didn't ask you here to reminisce. We need your help." Jesse's eyes flickered with a mix of curiosity and caution. "I figured that was why you called. But let's get one thing straight. I'm not some soldier you can just drag out of retirement for this." He looked between Clint and Evelyn. "You two are in way over your heads. Corbin is no small fish. The guy's got connections, resources, and a hell of a lot more than you realize." "We know," Clint said, his voice steely. "That's why we need you." Jesse shook his head. "You've got no idea how deep this runs. Corbin's not just playing in the shadows anymore. He's controlling the game from the top down. You think you've won because of a few pieces of evidence? Trust me, he's got a plan for that. The game's rigged, Clint, and I'm not sure how you plan to win against someone who controls everything." Clint felt the familiar rush of determination. He had spent years in the trenches of the CIA, facing off against corrupt officials, dangerous men, and seemingly insurmountable odds. Jesse was right. Corbin had built a fortress of influence, but Clint wasn't about to let that scare him off. This was no longer about playing defense. This was about taking control of the narrative, flipping the script, and going after Corbin, not the other way around. "Jesse, we don't have a choice," Clint said, his voice unwavering. "We expose Corbin, we tear down his empire, or we're dead. You know that better than anyone." Jesse sighed, leaning against the brick wall. "I didn't want to come back to this life, but I'm not stupid. If anyone can pull this off, it's you. You've got the guts, Clint. I'll give you that." Evelyn stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "We need intel, Jesse. We need everything you've got. Corbin has too many people working for him, and we don't have the time to dig through every file or make sense of his labyrinth of contacts. We need to hit him where it hurts, and we need to do it fast." Jesse rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes distant for a moment as he thought. "I've got people, eyes on the ground. If we can get to the right contacts, we might have a shot. But it's going to be messy. We'll need more than just intel. We'll need a full-out strike, and we'll need to be ready for whatever Corbin's got in store." Clint nodded. "I'm ready." Jesse pushed off the wall and took a step closer to Clint. "All right then, I'll help you. But just know this, Corbin's going to fight back hard. This isn't going to be a clean battle." "We've never been in a clean fight," Clint said, the edge of a smile tugging at his lips. "Let's do this." Back at Clint's apartment, the three of them gathered around a large table littered with maps, dossiers, and printouts of Corbin's connections. Jesse had wasted no time. He'd contacted his old network and managed to pull together a series of leads that could help them take down Corbin. Clint and Evelyn listened intently as Jesse outlined the plan. "First, we need to hit Corbin's financial operations," Jesse said, pointing to a series of bank accounts linked to shell companies. "This is where he's laundering money, moving funds around. If we can freeze his assets, we'll hit him where it hurts, his pocketbook. Once that's done, he'll be forced to expose himself." Clint and Evelyn exchanged a look. "How do we get to the accounts?" Evelyn asked. Jesse gave a wry smile. "That's where you come in, Clint. I've got a contact at the Treasury who owes me a favor. We can use him to access those accounts. It won't be easy, but it's doable." Clint nodded. We'll make it work. Jesse's expression grew more serious. Next, we need to expose Corbin's network. He's got people in high places, politicians, military officials, CEOs. The key to his power is his influence. We need to start pulling those strings and cutting them off one by one. And for that, we need dirt, damaging, undeniable dirt. Who's got the dirt? Clint asked, his voice low. Jesse didn't hesitate. I've got someone in mind, a former colleague of mine. He's got intel on Corbin's dealings, but he's been hiding for years. Getting to him will be a challenge, but if we can, it'll give us the leverage we need. Clint's jaw tightened. This was getting riskier by the minute, but there was no turning back now. Corbin had already made his move. It was time to make theirs. Evelyn looked at Clint. We can't waste any time. If we let Corbin regroup, it's over. Clint stood up, his resolve firm. Then we move out now. Jesse, you lead the way. We're all in this together. Jesse's lips twitched into a slight smile. All right, Clint, let's get to work. The plan was set into motion, and there was no turning back. Clint, Evelyn, and Jesse had crossed the line into a war against an adversary who would stop at nothing to win. But with every piece of Corbin's empire they tore down, the more dangerous things became. Corbin was no fool. He would come after them with everything he had. Clint knew this was just the beginning. They had their first targets, their first steps toward exposing Corbin's empire. But the road ahead was long, fraught with danger and uncertain. If they were going to take down Corbin, they needed to stay one step ahead and be ready for whatever came next. The dim glow of the computer screen reflected in Clint's tired eyes as he sat in the war room, his mind racing through the next steps. The plan was set. They had their target. But the problem was, time was running out. Corbin had been quiet since their meeting with Jesse, too quiet. It made Clint uneasy. He knew from experience that when an enemy didn't respond immediately, it often meant they were regrouping, plotting something far more dangerous. Maybe he was wrong, but he couldn't afford to take that chance. You're thinking too much, Evelyn said from the other side of the room. Her voice was calm, but Clint could hear the subtle edge of concern in it. Clint shook his head, as though trying to shake off the paranoia creeping in. I just don't trust him. Corbin's too smooth to let a little setback like this keep him down. He's always got something up his sleeve. Evelyn walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. I get it, but we've got this. We've got the contacts, we've got the intel, and most importantly, we've got each other. No matter what Corbin throws at us, we're not backing down. Clint looked up at her, the weight of their mission settling on his shoulders. I know. We've come this far. We're not stopping now. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation. The clock was ticking, and the walls seemed to close in as they prepared for their next move. The plan was simple. Get to Corbin's financial ties, hit him where it hurt, and follow the trail back to the top. The problem was, Corbin had built his empire on secrecy, and pulling apart his web of connections wasn't going to be as easy as pulling a string. Jesse's contact at the Treasury had come through, offering them the means to freeze some of Corbin's accounts, ones that tied him to illegal dealings and shady deals with international partners. But even with this information, Clint knew they had to be careful. They couldn't afford to tip their hand too early. It's time, Jesse said, walking into the room with a grim look on his face. The contact's ready. We move now. Clint nodded. The time for waiting was over. Jesse led them to a nondescript building in downtown, its faded exterior blending in with the rest of the city's mundane architecture. The building was an old office complex that had been repurposed over the years, but it still had a certain air of mystery around it. A couple of well-dressed men stood by the entrance, giving the illusion of normalcy. But Clint knew better. There were people inside who were either allies or enemies. He couldn't tell which, but it was a risk he had to take. Evelyn gave him a quick look, and he nodded, signaling that it was time. They had no choice now but to move forward. Inside, the place was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and stale coffee. The sounds of hushed voices and clinking keyboards filled the space. They walked through the hallways until they came to a locked door at the far end of the building. Jesse entered a code into the keypad, and the door clicked open. Inside was a small office, with a man sitting behind a desk. He looked up as they entered. Clint Eastwood, the man said, his voice neutral. I didn't think I'd see you again. What is it you want from me this time? Clint studied him closely. We need access to the accounts. The ones tied to Corbin. The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. You've got a lot of nerve, you know that? Corbin's not someone you want to mess with. But I guess that's why you're here, huh? Clint didn't flinch. I didn't come here for a lecture. We don't have time to waste. The man sighed, rubbing his temple. All right. You're lucky I'm not the one who'll have to clean up the mess. Just don't say I didn't warn you. He turned to his computer and began typing furiously. The sound of the keys echoed in the room, mixing with the silent tension that gripped the space. After a few moments, he looked up. Done, he said, pushing a USB drive across the desk toward Clint. The data's all there. But just so you know, once this goes public, Corbin won't just roll over. Be prepared. Clint didn't waste time. He grabbed the drive and turned to leave. Thanks, he said, his voice cold. Jesse led them out of the building, and once they were safely in the car, Clint felt a rush of adrenaline. They had what they needed. The accounts, the evidence, the leverage. But they weren't out of the woods yet. It wasn't long before the first signs of Corbin's retaliation began. As soon as Clint arrived at his apartment later that night, the phone calls started coming in. Some anonymous, others from blocked numbers. He didn't answer them. But when the knock on his door came, Clint knew it was time to face what he had been avoiding. He opened the door to find a messenger, a courier wearing a black suit. In his hand was an envelope. This is for you, the man said in a monotone voice. Clint took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in dark ink. You're playing with fire, Clint. Keep pushing, and you'll see how quickly it burns. Corbin. The words were simple, but Clint felt the weight of the threat behind them. Looks like he's finally ready to play dirty, Evelyn said from behind him, her voice sharp with the realization of what was at stake. Clint turned and glanced at her. This is just the beginning. But we've got the upper hand now. We can't stop. Evelyn's eyes darkened, but there was no hesitation in her voice. No turning back now. That night, Clint barely slept. His mind raced, replaying every move, every decision. The information they'd obtained was crucial, but Corbin wouldn't go down without a fight. He had too much power, too many people watching his every move. And while Clint had been careful not to reveal too much, he couldn't escape the reality that this was the most dangerous game he'd ever played. As dawn broke, the streets outside his window seemed eerily quiet. The world hadn't caught on to what was coming, but Clint knew everything was about to change. He grabbed the USB drive and walked over to the desk, pulling up the documents they'd just acquired. The next move would be critical, and he needed to stay one step ahead. Let's finish this, Clint muttered to himself. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The sound of Clint's boots echoed through the empty hallway, and the thick, heavy silence seemed to press against him like a wall. It was early morning, but Clint had never been a fan of sleep. His mind was consumed by the task ahead, getting ahead of Corbin before the city's underworld knew what had hit them. But the unease in his gut gnawed at him. It was the quiet after the storm. Too quiet. The message from Corbin, the one with the cryptic warning, had settled over him like a shroud. It wasn't just a threat. It was a statement of war. Corbin wasn't just angry. He was coming after them. And Clint didn't know how far the man was willing to go. At the apartment, Evelyn was waiting, her face pale and drawn. Clint, there's something you need to see. She was standing near the table, a stack of papers spread out before her. Clint felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he stepped closer, studying the documents. This came in the night, Evelyn continued, her voice steady but strained. The banks are being cleaned out. Not just Corbin's. All the ones we were targeting. Clint's eyes narrowed. What do you mean, cleaned out? They've been moving money fast. Transfer after transfer. Some to shell companies, others to unknown accounts overseas, Evelyn explained, turning a paper toward him. It's like someone's covering Corbin's tracks before we can do anything. Clint's jaw tightened. He'd known Corbin wouldn't take this lying down, But this was far worse than he anticipated. If Corbin was laundering money out of his own network before they could freeze his assets, it meant Clint's window of opportunity was closing faster than he'd thought. "Who's doing this?" Clint asked, his tone like steel. Evelyn hesitated, tapping her fingers nervously on the table. "I don't know, but there's one name that keeps popping up. Someone high up in Corbin's inner circle. Someone close." Clint's eyes flickered over the papers. The name that had been circling through the trail was familiar. Too familiar. It was someone Clint had trusted. Someone he thought was loyal. "Jesse," he muttered under his breath. Evelyn didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. They both knew that Jesse had been their ally from the start. But trust was a fragile thing in their line of work, and no one was immune from suspicion, not even him. Clint needed answers, and he needed them fast. Without wasting another second, he grabbed his phone and dialed Jesse's number, trying to remain calm despite the storm of questions raging in his mind. The phone rang once, then twice, then went to voicemail. "Damn it," Clint muttered. He tried again. Same result. It wasn't like Jesse to go silent, especially when their lives were on the line. Something was wrong. Clint's gut twisted. The possibility that Jesse might be part of the betrayal was too painful to entertain. But the evidence didn't lie. "Get ready," Clint said to Evelyn, the words slipping out before he even realized he was speaking. "We're going to see Jesse." It wasn't long before Clint and Evelyn arrived at Jesse's apartment, the setting sun casting long shadows over the street. Jesse had always lived in a nondescript building, but Clint noticed something strange as they parked. The light in his window was off. Jesse was always an early riser, always working late into the night. This wasn't like him. Clint's heart raced as he approached the door, a sinking feeling in his chest. When they knocked, there was no response. "Let's break it down," Clint said, his voice low. Without hesitation, he kicked the door open, and the sound of splintering would echoed through the hallway. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet. The lights were off, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and something far less pleasant, something Clint couldn't place. Evelyn moved through the room first, her eyes scanning every corner. It didn't take long before she called out, "Clint, over here." He rushed to her side, his pulse quickening as he looked at the scene before him. Jesse's apartment had been ransacked. The desk was overturned, papers scattered across the floor. A laptop was missing, along with his phone. And then, Clint saw it, the blood. A small pool of it, near the door to the back room. "Jesse," Clint whispered, his heart pounding. He was gone. But there was no sign of a struggle. Whoever took him had done so with brutal precision. Evelyn knelt beside the bloodstain, her eyes sharp. "He didn't leave willingly, Clint. This wasn't just a betrayal. Someone wanted him out of the picture." Clint ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "This doesn't make sense. Why take Jesse? He was working with us. If they wanted to silence him, they could have done it without dragging him into this." Evelyn's eyes flickered with suspicion. "What if he wasn't just working with us, Clint? What if he's the one working with Corbin?" Clint's throat tightened. He refused to believe it. Jesse had always been there, always had their backs. But as the pieces of the puzzle started to come together, he knew the truth would be much darker than he ever expected. "We need to find him," Clint said, his voice filled with determination. "And we need to do it fast. Corbin's making his move, and we've just walked right into his trap." As Clint and Evelyn scrambled to gather more information, they found themselves in a race against time. Corbin was tightening his grip, pulling strings behind the scenes and forcing their hand. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Corbin wasn't just playing a game of cat and mouse. He was taking them down, one step at a time. "Clint, we can't keep doing this alone," Evelyn said, breaking him from his thoughts. "We need backup." "I know," Clint replied, his eyes dark. "But not from anyone we know. We have to go underground. It's the only way to catch Corbin off guard." The city had always been a jungle, but now it felt more like a labyrinth. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that every alleyway, every corner was closing in on him, trapping him in a cage of paranoia. And Jesse, the one person he had trusted more than anyone else, was now missing, possibly at the hands of the very man Clint was trying to take down. How did we miss this? Evelyn asked, her voice clipped with frustration as she flipped through Jesse's last known contacts. We didn't miss it, Clint replied, his tone terse. We just never saw it coming. Corbin's too slick. He's been playing us from the start. Evelyn narrowed her eyes as she scrolled through the list of names on Jesse's phone, one in particular catching her attention. Hold on, she said, her fingers stopping on a contact. This name. It's not just some random number. It's a direct line to Corbin's right-hand man, Ray Simmons. Clint's pulse quickened. Ray Simmons was known in the underworld, not for his flashy persona, but for his ruthlessness. If Jesse had been in contact with him, it meant one of two things. Either Jesse had betrayed them, or he was in deeper than Clint could have ever imagined. We need to find Ray, Clint said, snapping into action. Evelyn nodded, already tapping away at her phone. I'll track down his last known location. But Clint, if Jesse's working with Corbin, this could get a lot more complicated. Clint's jaw tightened. It won't matter. We find Jesse, and we find the truth. The next few hours were a blur of calls, messages, and dead ends. Ray Simmons had a reputation for disappearing when the heat was on. It was as if he knew how to slip through the cracks, always one step ahead. But Clint had learned long ago that nothing stayed hidden forever. Not from him, anyway. Got him, Evelyn said suddenly, her voice tinged with excitement. Ray was spotted near an old warehouse on the east side of town. It's a long shot, but it's our best bet. Clint didn't waste another moment. He grabbed his jacket, heading out the door before Evelyn could finish speaking. The streets were empty as they drove through the city's industrial district. The buildings here were run down, the air thick with the smell of rust and diesel. This was where the city's dirty work happened, hidden away from the prying eyes of the public. As they pulled up to the warehouse, Clint's instinct screamed that something was off. The place looked abandoned, the windows covered with grime and steel shutters. But Clint knew better than to trust appearances. Stay sharp, he told Evelyn as they climbed out of the car. Corbin's got eyes everywhere. This could be a trap. The two of them moved quietly toward the entrance, their footsteps muffled by the crumbling concrete. Clint's hand hovered near the gun in his jacket, ready for whatever might come. They reached the large metal door, and Clint gave it a push. It creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The place was deserted, save for a few old crates and piles of discarded junk. But Clint wasn't fooled. Jesse? Clint called out, his voice echoing through the silence. There was no response. Evelyn moved to the side, scanning the shadows. I don't like this, she muttered. It's too quiet. Clint didn't reply. Instead, he moved deeper into the warehouse, the tension building with every step. He knew they were close, too close. And then, just as he was about to turn the corner, he froze. There, in the shadows, a figure stood, barely visible but unmistakable. It was Jesse. Clint's heart skipped a beat. Jesse? What the hell are you doing here? Jesse slowly stepped out of the shadows, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. But there was no warmth in his expression. His eyes were cold, different from the Jesse Clint had once trusted. You shouldn't have come, Jesse said, his voice hollow. Clint's stomach sank. What is this, Jesse? What's going on? Jesse shook his head, his eyes flickering with something like regret. You're in over your head, Clint. Corbin is too powerful. You can't stop him. Clint's grip tightened on his gun. I'm not stopping, but you need to tell me what's really going on here. There was a long pause before Jesse spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to hurt you, Clint, but Corbin has something on me, something big, and now he's got all of us. Clint's mind reeled. What are you talking about? Jesse looked down, his gaze shifting nervously. He's been running this operation for years. Everything, the money laundering, the arms deals, the government contracts, it's all tied together. He controls the flow of information. He's got people in high places, and he's got dirt on anyone who's ever crossed him. And now, he's going to use me to bring you down. Clint's mind raced as he processed Jesse's words. You've been working for him this whole time? He demanded. Jesse nodded, his face a mask of guilt. I never had a choice, Clint. I thought I could get out, but the deeper I got, the harder it became. And now, You're in danger. Corbin's not just after you. He's after everything you've built. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice sharp. So, you've been playing both sides? Using us to get what Corbin wanted? Jesse flinched but didn't answer. Clint's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to pull the trigger, to end this betrayal once and for all. But something in Jesse's eyes stopped him. The same man who had stood by his side all those years. The same man who had helped him build this fight against Corbin. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Jesse, Clint said, his voice cold. Jesse looked up, desperation creeping into his voice. Clint, you don't understand. If you go after Corbin now, you'll be walking into a trap. You're not just fighting him. You're fighting the system he controls. And no one can take him down alone. Clint's mind raced. Was Jesse telling the truth? Or was this all part of a bigger game? He could feel the trap closing around him. Time was running out. Tell me how to stop him, Clint demanded, his voice low and urgent. Jesse hesitated for a moment, then nodded. There's a backup plan. A way to hit him where it hurts. But it's risky. If we do this, there's no going back. Clint didn't hesitate. We'll do whatever it takes. The silence in the warehouse was deafening as Clint processed Jesse's words. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Betrayal, anger, confusion, and a reluctant understanding of the web they were all caught in. Corbin had played them like pawns on a chessboard, and now it was clear that the stakes had just gone up. Jesse's eyes were filled with regret, but there was no turning back now. He had said enough to make Clint question everything he thought he knew. Tell me everything, Clint ordered, his voice calm but cold. He couldn't afford to waste time. Every second they lingered here was another moment Corbin had to make his next move. Jesse swallowed hard, then took a deep breath. Corbin has a facility, an underground network where he runs everything. His money, his operations, his people. It's completely off the grid, Clint. Not even the government knows about it. If you want to take him down, that's where you need to go. Clint's eyes narrowed. So, what's the plan? We storm the place? Go in guns blazing? Jesse shook his head slowly. No. If we do that, we're dead before we even get to the door. Corbin's got eyes everywhere. He'll know the moment we set foot near the place. Evelyn, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. Then what do you suggest? We sit here and wait for Corbin to come to us? Jesse hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the danger of what he was about to propose. There's a way in, but it's risky. It's not a guaranteed success, and we don't have much time. If Corbin figures out what we're doing, he'll stop us before we even get close. Clint's eyes were fixed on Jesse. We're running out of options. Tell me the plan. Jesse nodded, his expression serious. Corbin trusts his inner circle. Ray Simmons, his lawyer, a few others. But there's one person he trusts above all. A hacker named Zoe. She's the one who handles all his secure communication. If we get to her, we can access Corbin's entire network. All the intel, all the money trails, everything we need to bring him down. Where is she? Clint asked, his voice steady. She's always moving, Jesse replied. But I know her safe house. It's a small apartment on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. We can get to her, but we'll need to move fast. Evelyn leaned forward. And how do we get her to cooperate? If she's working with Corbin, why would she help us? Jesse looked at her, his eyes hard. Zoe's not loyal to Corbin. She's in it for the money, the thrill. But she's also afraid of him. If we can promise her a way out, we might be able to convince her to help us. Clint's mind was racing. The plan was dangerous. Going after Zoe meant crossing into Corbin's territory, and if they failed, it would be the end. But the alternative was worse. Sitting back and letting Corbin take control, never knowing when the next strike would come. How do we get to her without being noticed? Evelyn asked, her voice laced with concern. We'll need to be discreet, Jesse replied. Zoe's paranoid, so we can't afford to make any noise. I've got a contact who can get us the key to the apartment and help us avoid surveillance. Clint exchanged a look with Evelyn. They both knew this wasn't a decision they could take lightly. But time was running out. We go tonight, Clint said, his tone leaving no room for argument. We find Zoe, we get the intel, and we end this. It didn't take long for Clint, Evelyn, and Jesse to prepare for the operation. They gathered their gear in silence, the weight of the mission pressing on them. Clint's mind was focused. Every move, every step, had to be calculated. There was no room for mistakes. As the night drew closer, Jesse made a few calls. He didn't like the idea of involving anyone else, but this wasn't a job for a small team. They needed every advantage they could get. "Contact's good," Jesse said after a brief conversation on his phone. "We meet him at the parking garage near Zoe's apartment. He'll give us the key and help us get in unnoticed." Evelyn checked her equipment, her gun, her earpiece, her gear. "I'm ready." Clint gave a short nod. "Let's move out." The streets were eerily quiet as they made their way through the city. The moonlight bathed the buildings in a pale glow, casting long shadows on the pavement. Clint kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hand resting near his gun. They were walking into enemy territory, and one wrong move could bring the whole operation crashing down. The parking garage was a few blocks away from Zoe's apartment. As they pulled into the dimly lit structure, Clint scanned the area for any signs of trouble. There were no cars parked near the entrance, and the only sound was the echo of their footsteps as they made their way to the elevator. "I'll go first," Jesse said, as he led them toward the back of the garage, where their contact was supposed to meet them. Minutes later, a man in a dark hoodie emerged from the shadows. He handed Jesse a small key card, his face barely visible under the hood. "She's in apartment 206, he whispered, keeping his voice low. "There's a back entrance you can use to avoid the cameras. Be quick." Clint took the key card without a word, then gestured for Evelyn to follow him. They made their way to the back of the apartment building, where the alley was dark and narrow. Evelyn moved quietly, her footsteps barely making a sound. Clint kept his eyes open, scanning every corner. They reached the back door, and Jesse quickly unlocked it. Inside, the apartment was small, but it was neat, organized. Nothing like the chaos Clint had expected from someone working for Corbin. It was almost too perfect, too quiet. "Stay sharp," Clint muttered, his voice low. She could be anywhere. They moved through the apartment, checking each room carefully. When they reached the last door, Jesse stopped. "This is it." Clint nodded and carefully opened the door, his hand on his gun. The room was dimly lit, with a desk against the wall and multiple computer screens flickering in the corner. But there was no sign of Zoe. "Where is she?" Evelyn whispered. Looking around, Clint stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the screens. "She's here somewhere. We just need to find her." And then they heard it, the sound of something moving behind them. Clint spun around, gun drawn, but it was too late. The sound of a soft shuffle was the only warning before the door to Zoe's apartment swung open. Clint's hand instinctively tightened around the grip of his gun, his eyes darting toward the source of the noise. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a woman, no taller than average, with sharp features and a cold, calculating gaze. She stepped into the dim light, her blonde hair tucked under a beanie, her expression as impassive as the screen she'd been staring at earlier. "Zoe, you're too late," Zoe said, her voice barely a whisper, but the tension in her words was unmistakable. Clint's heart raced. He hadn't expected to find her here, not like this, not so ready, so composed. "I don't think you understand the situation," he replied, his voice controlled but urgent. "We're not here to hurt you. We need your help." Zoe didn't flinch, her eyes never leaving his as she tilted her head slightly. "And why would I help you? You're just another part of Corbin's mess." Clint's gut twisted at the mention of Corbin's name, but he couldn't let that cloud his judgment now. "I'm not working for Corbin," he said, keeping his tone steady. "I'm trying to stop him. We know what he's doing, what he's planning. You're the only person who can help us take him down." Evelyn stepped closer, her voice laced with impatience. "We don't have time for games, Zoe. If you don't help us, we won't hesitate to take what we need from you." Zoe's lips curled into a knowing smile. "You think I'm afraid of you? You're all just pawns in Corbin's game. He's been watching every step you've taken. He knows you're here." Clint's eyes flicked to Jesse, standing silently by the door. Jesse's face was unreadable, but Clint could sense something was off. The air seemed to thicken with tension as Zoe continued to speak, her words colder with each passing moment. Corbin knew you'd come after me, Zoe continued, her tone almost mocking. He's always 2 steps ahead of you. Clint's pulse quickened. What are you talking about? How does he know we're here? A soft chuckle escaped Zoe's lips. You think I'm just some hacker hiding behind a screen? She moved slowly toward one of her computer monitors, tapping in a few commands. The screen flickered, revealing a map of the city. A map that zoomed in on Clint's location. That's how, Zoe said, her eyes gleaming with a cold satisfaction. You've been walking right into his trap. I'm not his ally. I'm his insurance. Before Clint could respond, the apartment's door slammed shut behind them. Move, a voice growled from the doorway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. It wasn't just Zoe in this apartment anymore. There were others, at least 3 or 4 men, all armed, all with the same ruthless look that Clint had seen in Corbin's men before. They'd been waiting. Jesse's face turned ashen as one of the men moved closer, his eyes narrowing with cold recognition. Jesse, the man said, his voice thick with contempt. Thought you could run, huh? Zoe raised a hand, silencing her men. Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. Clint, Evelyn, Jesse's already out of the game. You should have stayed away. Now you're part of the problem. Clint's mind raced. The situation had spiraled faster than he could have anticipated. He glanced at Evelyn, then at Jesse, whose shoulders were slumped in defeat. It was clear now. He'd been playing both sides all along. And the moment they'd stepped into this trap, they'd sealed their fate. Clint stood tall, refusing to show the fear creeping up inside him. He had no choice now but to confront the reality that their plan had been compromised. He turned toward Zoe. You're not going to win this. Corbin's game ends tonight. Zoe's eyes flickered with something between amusement and pity. You really think you can stop him? He's untouchable. And you're just pawns, Clint. Just like Jesse. At that moment, Jesse took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. I didn't want this, Clint. I thought I could protect you, protect everyone. But Corbin, he has leverage. He always does. Clint's jaw clenched as he faced Jesse. There was no time for regret now. You made your choice, Jesse, and now we have to make ours. The room was tense, the standoff palpable. It was clear they were on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, one misstep, and it would all come crashing down. Clint knew he couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, not when everything was on the line. We're leaving, Clint said, his voice firm, but his eyes scanning the room for an escape. If you want to play Corbin's game, that's on you. But if you try to stop us, I'll make sure it's the last mistake you ever make. Zoe's lips twitched into a smirk. You think you can just walk out? Not without consequences. Clint didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed Evelyn's arm and gestured toward the door. With a look, they both understood. There wasn't time for negotiations, only survival. As they turned to leave, the men in the room began to move toward them. The tension broke like a dam. Evelyn fired first, a shot ringing through the room as one of the men fell to the floor. Another man lunged at them, but Clint ducked, pulling Evelyn behind him as they raced toward the exit. Go! Clint shouted, adrenaline surging through his veins. They burst through the door, racing down the hallway and into the stairwell. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were deafening. Footsteps echoed in the narrow space as Zoe's men chased after them. But Clint wasn't about to be caught. Stay close, he ordered, pulling Evelyn ahead of him as they dashed down the stairs and out into the alley. They reached the street, their breath ragged, hearts pounding. But as they turned the corner, something caught Clint's eye. A car. Black, sleek, unmistakable. Ray Simmons. Clint felt a chill run down his spine. He should have known. This was far from over. Get in the car, Clint ordered, his voice tight with urgency. Now. As they climbed into the car, Clint shot one last glance at the apartment building. Zoe had just played her part in Corbin's game, but it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The screech of tires and the roar of an engine cut through the night as Clint slammed the car into gear, speeding away from the alley. Behind them, Zoe's men were closing in fast, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. But it wasn't just the sound of pursuit that had Clint's stomach twisted in knots. It was the realization that they just played into Corbin's hands. Sitting in the back of the sleek black car, Evelyn's eyes were wide with shock, and her hand was still gripped tightly around the gun. "We've got to lose them. Now," she said, her voice tense but steady. Clint's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror as he made a sharp turn down another street. The glow of headlights in the distance reflected off the buildings as their pursuers followed, gaining ground. But it wasn't just Zoe's men Clint was worried about anymore. Something else was gnawing at him, an unsettling feeling deep in his gut. "There's no time," he muttered. "We need to deal with Ray Simmons before we can even think about getting away." Evelyn turned her head toward him, confusion etched on her face. "Ray Simmons? What's he got to do with this?" Clint's jaw clenched as he took another turn, his eyes narrowing with focus. "Ray's Corbin's right-hand man. If he's involved, that means everything just got a lot more complicated." Jesse, who had been sitting silently in the front passenger seat, suddenly spoke up, his voice hoarse with regret. "Clint, I didn't know. I didn't think Ray was involved in any of this. I swear." Clint's eyes flicked to him, his gaze hard. "You expect me to believe that? After everything that's happened? You've been playing both sides this whole time?" Jesse's hands gripped the seat, his knuckles white. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to betray you, but I didn't have a choice. Ray's got dirt on me. He's got leverage over me. And I couldn't just walk away." Evelyn's expression darkened as she looked at Jesse. "So, you've been working with him? After everything we've been through?" "I didn't want to," Jesse replied, his voice cracking, "but I had no other option. Ray's got too much power, and Corbin's not the only one with eyes on us." Clint's mind was racing. He had trusted Jesse, and now the betrayal stung more than ever. "You should have told us," Clint said, his voice low, laced with fury. "Now we're tangled in this mess because of you." As they sped through the city streets, Clint's thoughts were clouded by the intensity of the situation. They were headed straight for a confrontation with Ray Simmons, a man who could destroy them all in an instant. They needed a plan, one that could get them out of this alive. Suddenly, the car jolted, and the tires squealed in protest as Clint made another hard turn, narrowly avoiding a parked vehicle. The car was a blur of motion, but Clint could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him. If Ray was involved, it meant he was one of Corbin's most trusted allies. They couldn't just confront him head-on. They needed to think smarter. "Clint," Evelyn said, her voice suddenly sharper, more urgent, "we need to get off the main streets. They'll corner us if we don't." Clint nodded, his hands gripping the wheel tighter as he veered down a side street. The narrow alleyways were the only option now. He glanced at Jesse, his eyes narrowing. "How do we find Ray's location? You've been close to him, right?" Jesse hesitated, looking guilty. "Ray's got a private estate on the outskirts of town. It's heavily guarded, but there's an old access road that leads to the back entrance. If we take that route, we might be able to sneak in without being noticed." Clint thought for a moment. It was a gamble, but it was the only option they had. "All right, we take the access road. But Jesse, if you're leading us into another trap—" "I'm not," Jesse interrupted quickly, his voice defensive. "I swear, this is the only way." Clint didn't respond. He didn't have time for more excuses. They had to act fast. The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity as they made their way through the winding backroads. The engine of the car hummed steadily, but Clint's heart was pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of the danger they were heading straight into. Evelyn kept her gun at the ready, her eyes scanning the darkened streets. Jesse sat quietly, his body tense, his hands gripping the edge of the seat as if he were ready to bolt at any second. Finally, the car slowed to a crawl as they approached the outskirts of town. The private estate loomed ahead. Massive gates, tall iron fences, and security cameras that seemed to cover every inch of the property. It was a fortress, a place designed to keep out the most persistent of threats. Clint studied the scene with cold calculation. "We'll need to be quick," he muttered. "In and out. No mistakes." Jesse nodded, his face grim. "I'll take you to the back entrance. Just follow me." As the car reached the entrance to the private estate, Jesse pointed toward a small, almost hidden gate in the fence. "There," he said. That's the way in. Clint glanced at Evelyn, who nodded in agreement. They weren't going to get another shot at this. The car slid to a stop as Clint put the vehicle in park. The night air was still, and the shadows seemed to stretch on forever. "Let's move," Clint ordered, his voice low. They quickly got out of the car, making their way toward the gate. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of their footfalls and the adrenaline coursing through their veins. Jesse led the way, glancing over his shoulder as they approached the gate. "Once we're in," Jesse whispered, "the back entrance will lead us straight to Ray's office. We can confront him there." Clint didn't say anything. He wasn't sure how much he could trust Jesse anymore, but there was no turning back now. They had to move forward, even if it meant walking straight into the lion's den. As Jesse unlocked the gate and motioned for them to follow, Clint's mind was racing with the possibilities. They were about to face Ray Simmons, one of Corbin's closest allies. If this was a trap, there was no escape. But if it wasn't, this could be their one chance to strike at the heart of Corbin's operation. Inside the estate, everything was eerily quiet. No guards, no security, at least, not immediately visible. The stillness only deepened the unease in Clint's gut. They slipped through the gate, moving cautiously toward the back entrance of the mansion. Every step felt like it could be their last. The air inside Ray Simmons' estate felt thick with tension, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath. Clint moved forward cautiously, his instincts on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the trees outside made his pulse race. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The stakes had never been higher. Jesse led them silently through the labyrinthine halls of the estate, moving with an almost unnatural familiarity. Clint glanced at him, suspicion still lingering in his mind. Could Jesse really be trusted? Had he been manipulated by Ray all along? It was hard to shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. As they neared a door at the end of the hall, Jesse stopped, turning back to face Clint and Evelyn. His eyes were wide, a flash of fear in them for the first time since they had entered the estate. "Ray's office is just through here," he whispered, his voice tight. "But I need to warn you, this could get ugly. He won't let you leave here without a fight." Clint's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "We knew what we were walking into." Jesse hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "I'll take point. Just follow me." The tension was almost unbearable as they stepped forward, the door creaking open slowly. Ray Simmons' office was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the room. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the only sounds the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth and the soft ticking of a clock. Everything about the room screamed power. Sleek furniture, expensive artwork, and the unmistakable feeling of wealth and control. And then, there he was. Ray Simmons, seated behind a massive mahogany desk, his sharp eyes studied them with an unsettling calm. He was a tall man, his features hard and chiseled, a cold smile curling at the corners of his lips. His presence was like a heavy fog, suffocating and all-encompassing. Well, Ray said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was wondering when you'd show up. You've made quite a mess of things, haven't you?" Clint's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his composure. "This ends tonight, Ray. You and Corbin are going down." Ray chuckled, a low, mirthless sound that echoed through the room. "Is that so? You really think you can just waltz in here and take me down? You're in my house now, Clint. You're playing by my rules." Evelyn stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Ray. "We know everything about Corbin's operation. We know you've been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. It's over." Ray leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the surface of his desk. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "It's over, but not in the way you think." Clint's heart skipped a beat. Something in Ray's demeanor had shifted. There was a darkness in his eyes now, a sense of finality. Before Clint could respond, Ray pressed a button on his desk, and the doors to the office swung open. Two armed men stepped in, guns drawn, their eyes trained on Clint and Evelyn. Clint's hand instinctively went to his own weapon, but Ray's voice stopped him. "Don't bother," Ray said coldly. "You'll never leave here alive. Not with the evidence I have on you." Clint's pulse spiked. What evidence? Ray smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. I've been keeping a close eye on you. Everything, every move you've made, every decision you've taken, has been carefully monitored. You think you've been outsmarting Corbin? You've been playing right into his hands. Jesse's head shot up, his face pale. Ray, what are you talking about? Ray's smile widened. You didn't think you could hide your little betrayal from me, did you, Jesse? You've been a double agent this whole time, feeding Clint and Evelyn all the wrong information. And now, it's too late for you to back out. Clint turned sharply toward Jesse, disbelief written across his face. Jesse, what the hell? You've been working with him? Jesse's eyes were wide with fear, and his hands were shaking. I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Ray, he has dirt on me. He's blackmailing me. Ray's gaze never wavered as he looked at Jesse. I gave you everything, Jesse. And this is how you repay me? I thought we had an understanding. But you made a mistake. Clint's mind was racing. He had always known there was something off about Jesse's sudden change of heart, but he never expected this. The betrayal stung, but there was no time for regret. Not now. Ray, Clint said, his voice low and dangerous. You think you've won, don't you? Ray's eyes gleamed. I don't just think it. I know it. Suddenly, everything seemed to move in slow motion. One of Ray's men stepped forward, gun aimed at Clint. The air crackled with tension as Evelyn's hand darted for her weapon, her fingers already gripping the trigger. Jesse's face was twisted with guilt and fear, but there was nothing he could do now. Clint's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been preparing for. But as the gunman took aim, Clint knew they weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for the truth. With a swift motion, Clint lunged to the side, knocking over a chair in the process. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the room as bullets ricocheted off the walls. The air was filled with chaos, and time seemed to freeze as Clint and Evelyn reacted instinctively. In the heart of Ray Simmons' office, chaos erupted. Clint's mind was racing, but his movements were precise, honed by years of experience. He ducked behind a bookshelf, the staccato of gunfire ringing in his ears as Evelyn returned fire. Her shots were calculated, each one designed to disable rather than kill, keeping the gunman at bay. Jesse, caught in the crossfire, scrambled behind a desk, his eyes wide with panic. Clint, he started, but his voice was drowned out by the violence. Ray stood unmoving, his cold smile never faltering as the chaos unfolded around him. He knew this was just part of the game. Clint and Evelyn had no idea what they were really up against. They weren't just up against Corbin's forces anymore. They were fighting against a system so entrenched that even their best efforts might not be enough to bring it down. Clint fired again, his bullet finding its mark. One of Ray's men dropped to the floor, blood staining the plush carpet beneath them. But there was no time to celebrate. They were outnumbered and outgunned. And just when Clint thought they might have a chance, the door to Ray's office burst open once more. A figure stepped in, a new player in the game, and Clint's stomach dropped. The figure in the doorway moved with the grace of someone who knew exactly how to command attention. Clint's pulse quickened as he tried to make out the newcomer, but the light from the chandelier above cast long shadows, obscuring much of their face. In that moment, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Ray. The voice was calm, yet undeniably authoritative. I think we need to talk. Ray Simmons' expression didn't change, though the brief flicker of recognition in his eyes was hard to miss. You, he said with a tight smile, clearly not pleased to see the person standing before him. You're either brave or foolish to show up here. Clint's instinct screamed at him to be on alert, but there was something different about the way this stranger carried themselves. There was no hesitation in their movements, no fear in their eyes. They were here for something, and Clint wasn't sure if they were an enemy or an ally. The figure stepped into the room, and the door clicked shut behind them with finality. They were tall, their silhouette sharp against the dim light. It was hard to tell much more about them from the shadows, but Clint could tell they weren't someone to be taken lightly. A faint glint of metal on their wrist caught his attention, but before he could analyze it further, the figure's voice cut through the tension. You've made a mess of things, Ray. the newcomer said, stepping closer to the desk. But I'm here to clean it up. Ray's lips tightened, but he didn't move, as if weighing his options. His voice was colder now. What are you doing here? This doesn't concern you. Clint's hand was still on his gun, though it now rested loosely at his side, uncertain. He exchanged a glance with Evelyn, who stood across from him, also on edge but intrigued. Jesse, on the other hand, had his head lowered, looking every bit the guilty party in this deadly game. Ray finally turned his attention away from the stranger and focused on Clint. You should have known, Clint. There's always more at play. You think you've won? You haven't even begun to understand what you're up against. He paused, eyeing the newcomer again. This is bigger than you, bigger than Corbin. This is a game you'll never win. Clint narrowed his eyes. Then help me understand, Ray. Who are they? He asked, gesturing toward the person who had just entered the room. The figure's gaze flicked over Clint, then toward Ray. My name is Catherine Hale, they said, finally stepping fully into the light. Her features became clearer, sharp, and calculating. She was wearing a tailored black suit, and her posture was straight, giving her an air of absolute confidence. A faint scar ran along her cheek, a remnant of past battles. Her eyes, however, were the most striking, calm, yet full of something deeper, something dangerous. Ray's expression twisted into a sneer. Hale, I should have known it was you. Catherine's smile was thin, almost predatory. You've always known it was me, Ray. You just didn't want to face the truth. She turned her gaze toward Clint and Evelyn. I'm not your enemy, she added, her voice soft but firm. I've been watching from the sidelines, but it seems now I need to get involved. Clint's brow furrowed. Watching from the sidelines? He asked, taking a cautious step forward. You're with him? Catherine chuckled, the sound low and self-assured. Not exactly. Ray and I have history, but that's not why I'm here. She looked over at Jesse, her eyes narrowing. And you, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. You've been playing both sides, haven't you? Jesse shifted uncomfortably, guilt written all over his face. I never meant for it to get this far, he mumbled. Ray has something on me, something I couldn't escape. Catherine's eyes flicked back to Ray. Well, it's over now, Ray. The game's up. Clint, now more confused than ever, stepped closer. What do you want, Catherine? Why should we trust you? Catherine paused for a moment, assessing Clint carefully. Then, her gaze softened, just slightly. Because we're after the same thing, Clint. You want Ray out of the picture. So do I. Ray's laugh was bitter. You think you can take me down, Hale? You're nothing more than a cog in a machine that's too big for either of us to stop. Perhaps, Catherine replied coolly, but I can assure you, the machine is going to fall apart, whether you like it or not. The silence in the room felt suffocating as Ray and Catherine locked eyes. Clint exchanged another glance with Evelyn, who was watching the scene unfold with growing suspicion. What exactly are you proposing? Clint asked, not lowering his guard. He had no reason to trust Catherine, but something about her presence told him she wasn't bluffing. Catherine turned her gaze back to Clint. I can help you bring down Ray, but in exchange, you'll need to trust me with something. Something important. Clint wasn't ready to let his guard down, but he couldn't ignore the fact that they were facing an opponent who had the power and the resources to make their lives miserable. Ray had connections everywhere, and if Catherine was offering a way to stop him, Clint had to hear her out. What do you want? He asked cautiously. Catherine's expression hardened. I want to know everything you've uncovered about the CIA's involvement. I need to know how deep the corruption runs. This is bigger than just Ray. This is about exposing an entire network of corruption that's been operating under the radar for years. Clint's heart skipped a beat. This was no longer just about taking down one man. This was about unraveling an entire operation, one that had far-reaching implications. If what Catherine was saying was true, their fight was just beginning. I'm listening, Clint said. Clint stood silently, his mind racing. Catherine Hale's offer was tempting, but trusting her felt like stepping into the unknown. Her words echoed in his mind. This is bigger than just Ray. This is about exposing an entire network of corruption. Evelyn's voice cut through the tension, her tone steady but laced with skepticism. You want us to trust you with everything we've found. But why should we believe you? You've been playing both sides, and now you're offering to help? Catherine's eyes flicked toward Evelyn, a flicker of respect crossing her features. You're right to question me. But consider this. Ray isn't just a criminal. He's a piece in a much larger puzzle. If we don't work together, we'll all lose. I'm not here to play games. I'm here to win. Clint shot a glance at Evelyn, who seemed to be weighing her options. Jesse, who had been silently observing the exchange, looked like he was about to speak, but Catherine's sharp gaze silenced him instantly. She knew exactly how to command the room, and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that she was just as dangerous as Ray, but for a different reason. We're in no position to make deals, Clint said, keeping his voice low. Ray has eyes everywhere, and I'm not sure I trust you enough to turn over what we've uncovered. Catherine's expression hardened. You don't have to trust me, but you need to understand something. Ray isn't just a businessman. He's a player in a much larger game. One that has the power to bring down entire governments, control nations, manipulate world events. He's been using his influence to stay one step ahead, but that's going to end. If we don't take him down now, the consequences will be catastrophic. The gravity of her words hung in the air, heavier than the oppressive silence that followed. Clint's mind raced as he thought about the countless lives that had been destroyed by Ray's empire. The drug trade, the human trafficking, the political manipulation, it all led back to him. But Catherine's cryptic warning about something much bigger made Clint wonder how much deeper the rabbit hole went. Why now? Evelyn asked, her skepticism still evident. Why come to us now, when you've been watching from the sidelines? Catherine's gaze flicked to Ray, who was now silently observing the exchange, his face unreadable. Because Ray has overplayed his hand. The evidence you've gathered about him, it's crucial. But there's more to it, more that I can help you uncover. You don't have the full picture yet, Clint. You're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Clint's thoughts were interrupted by a cold chuckle from Ray. You think she can save you, Clint? You're making a mistake. She's been playing you from the start. Catherine's lips curled into a smile, but there was no humor in it. Ray, you've been playing this game for far too long. You've convinced yourself that you're untouchable, but that's about to change. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching out like an eternity. Clint could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. On one hand, Catherine's offer was tempting. She knew things they didn't, and her presence had undeniably shifted the balance of power. On the other hand, trusting her felt like gambling with his life. We don't have time for this, Clint said, his voice cutting through the silence. We need to take action. If you want our help, we do it on our terms. And we'll need to know exactly what you're asking for. Catherine's expression softened slightly, as if she expected Clint to say that. Fair enough. Here's the deal. You hand over everything you've uncovered about Ray's operations, and in return, I'll make sure the CIA doesn't wipe you out. I'll also give you the leverage you need to take down Corbin and anyone else in Ray's network. Clint exchanged another glance with Evelyn, who nodded subtly, though it was clear she was still unsure. Jesse, on the other hand, looked like he might pass out from the tension. We'll need guarantees, Evelyn said, her voice steady. This can't be a one-way street. You say you're going after Ray, but how do we know you're not just using us? Catherine smiled, her eyes glinting with something Clint couldn't quite place. You have my word. And more than that, I have the resources to make sure Ray pays for everything he's done. But I can't do it without you. Clint considered her words carefully. There was a part of him that wanted to walk away, to refuse her offer and take matters into his own hands. But the reality was harsh. They didn't have the resources, and Ray was too powerful to take down alone. If Catherine was offering them a way to fight back, it was an opportunity they couldn't afford to ignore. All right, Clint said finally. We'll give you what you want, but we need to move quickly. Ray's got too many people watching. Catherine's smile widened, but there was a steely edge to it. Agreed. But remember, Clint, trust goes both ways. If you try to cross me, you'll regret it. Ray's eyes narrowed as he watched the conversation unfold. You really think you can outsmart me? He sneered, his voice low and dangerous. Catherine turned to face him, her posture unyielding. I've outsmarted you before, Ray, and I'll do it again. The room was thick with tension as the two adversaries locked eyes. Clint knew they were at a crossroads, and the path ahead was fraught with peril. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might just have an ally who could help him win this war. Ray didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted to the window, as if calculating his next move. For a moment, it seemed as if the game had reached an impasse. But Clint wasn't foolish enough to think this was over. Ray Simmons wouldn't go down without a fight, and neither would Catherine Hale. The battle for control of the Empire was about to intensify. Clint had just entered into an alliance with someone he barely understood. But in this dangerous world, sometimes your enemies were the only ones who could help you bring down the bigger threats. Clint sat at the table, a map of the city spread out before him. His mind was racing as he studied the connections between Ray Simmons' empire, trying to find the next move. Evelyn sat across from him, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. She was the only one Clint trusted implicitly, and yet, the uncertainty of their situation gnawed at him. Catherine stood near the window, watching the street below with a sharp gaze. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't fully revealing everything, but at this point, they had no choice but to move forward with the alliance. If they were going to bring Ray down, they needed every piece of the puzzle. "I've been thinking," Evelyn broke the silence, her voice cutting through the tension. "Ray's empire isn't just about power and money. It's about control. He's got connections everywhere, law enforcement, politicians, businesses. If we're going to take him down, we need to attack from all angles." Clint nodded, his eyes narrowing as he ran a hand through his hair. "I agree, but we don't have the manpower to go after everything at once. We'll need to focus on the weak points, the places where Ray's grip is slipping." Catherine, who had been silent for most of the conversation, turned to face them. Her expression was unreadable, but Clint could see the wheels turning in her mind. "You're right," she said. "Ray's empire is built on secrecy. If we want to dismantle it, we need to expose the cracks. I've been gathering intel on his financial operations. There's a weakness in his overseas investments." Clint raised an eyebrow. "Overseas?" Catherine stepped forward, pulling a folder from her bag and laying it on the table. Inside were pages of financial documents, transaction records, and maps showing Ray's international ties. Ray's been laundering money through a network of shell companies in several countries. He's been using these operations to fund his other activities: human trafficking, weapons deals, even political manipulation. Evelyn leaned in, her eyes scanning the documents. "These are big players. If we can expose this network, we can hit him where it hurts the most." Clint's gaze flicked back to Catherine. "And you're sure about all this? You've got solid intel?" Catherine's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "I've been tracking this for months. I know exactly where to hit, but it's going to take careful planning." Clint paused, thinking for a moment. "We'll need backup. This isn't something we can pull off alone." "We don't have the luxury of waiting for backup," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "Ray will move before we can act. We strike fast and hard, before he knows what hit him." Clint agreed, but there was something about the plan that didn't sit right with him. The danger was real, and Ray wasn't the only one they had to worry about. There were others, people in powerful positions, who would protect Ray at all costs. "All right," Clint said, standing up. "We go after his financial empire first. That'll disrupt his operations, hit him where it hurts. But we need to be ready for retaliation. Ray won't go down quietly." Evelyn nodded. "We'll need to move quickly. We'll have to split up. You and I can hit the local network. Catherine, you'll need to focus on the international connections. Once we have the evidence, we take it public. Ray won't be able to escape." Catherine's lips curled into a slight smile. "That's the plan, then. I'll start working on the international side of things. You two handle the local operations. We'll coordinate as we go." Clint didn't like it. The whole plan felt rushed. They were running on a tight timeline, and the risk of exposure was high. But they didn't have the luxury of time. Ray was out there, growing stronger by the day, and every minute they wasted could mean another life lost. "We move at dawn," Clint said, his voice firm. "No mistakes." As they dispersed, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of the decisions they were making. Each move they made now brought them closer to Ray, and closer to the edge of the storm that was about to break. The next morning came quickly. Clint and Evelyn were up before dawn, preparing for their part of the mission. The city was still dark, the streets empty, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight. The quiet before the storm. Clint checked his gear one last time, ensuring everything was in place. Evelyn was already assembling a list of contacts, people they could trust, people who owed them favors. They needed every ally they could get. If things went sideways, they'd need to call in every favor to survive. The plan was simple. Hit the local network first. Ray's primary operations in the city had been centered around his various businesses, high-end real estate, restaurants, and clubs, all fronts for his criminal activities. They would infiltrate the businesses, gather evidence, and disrupt his operations. Catherine had already left, headed for the international connections. Clint trusted her to follow through, but there was always the nagging thought in the back of his mind. Could they truly trust her? Was she playing them? Or was she as committed to taking down Ray as they were? They met at the rendezvous point, a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Evelyn was already there, her laptop open, working on the details. Clint slid into the chair across from her, his eyes scanning the room as he took a seat. "We've got a problem," Evelyn said without looking up. "Ray's already onto us." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know?" "I've got a contact inside one of his businesses. They're cleaning house, getting rid of anything that could tie them to Ray's illegal operations." Clint cursed under his breath. "We don't have much time then. We'll need to move faster." Evelyn's fingers flew over the keys, pulling up the last piece of intel. "I've got a location. Ray's using an old warehouse near the docks to stash some of his most sensitive records. If we can get in there, we can find everything we need to expose him." Clint leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Let's go." The sound of the docks was deafening. Clint and Evelyn had moved quickly, dodging the early morning traffic as they made their way to the old warehouse by the water. The place was dark, its looming silhouette casting a long shadow over the quiet harbor. The pungent smell of salt water mixed with the thick, musty air surrounding the warehouse. This was Ray's hidden world, a world that now, with each step they took, was beginning to unravel. Clint checked his watch, 3 minutes until the rendezvous. The plan was simple. Get in, retrieve whatever they could find, and get out before anyone noticed. There were no second chances here. One wrong move, and Ray's men would be all over them. "Are you sure this is the place?" Evelyn whispered, her voice low but filled with tension. Clint nodded, his jaw tight. "This is it. If Ray's hiding anything, it's here. His operations are too big now. He's using this warehouse to keep everything out of sight." Evelyn's eyes scanned the building, darting from window to window, looking for signs of life. "We'll have to be quick. We're not the only ones who know about this place." Clint agreed, but the weight of the situation bore down on him harder with every passing second. There were no more small-time players involved. Ray had escalated things to a level they couldn't ignore anymore, and Catherine's intel was their only shot at bringing him down. Evelyn was the first to move, slipping into the shadows as they approached the warehouse. Clint followed, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. The plan was to get inside, find the evidence, and get out. No distractions, no detours. "Stay close," Clint murmured, his voice barely audible in the wind. As they neared the side entrance, Evelyn stopped, signaling Clint to wait. He crouched beside her, heart pounding in his chest. They could hear the faint sound of voices inside, the low murmur of men speaking in hushed tones, and the occasional clink of metal against concrete. Clint motioned for Evelyn to move forward. She was the better infiltrator, always the first to spot potential dangers, always the one with the most patience. He trusted her instincts implicitly. They crept toward the door, and with a quick glance, Evelyn nodded and turned the handle. The door creaked open with a soft, eerie sound. They slipped inside, their steps light as they moved into the shadowed interior of the warehouse. The large room was filled with rows of crates, stacked high and covered in dust. The faint scent of oil and rust hung in the air. They made their way through the rows of crates, each step measured, as they carefully avoided the creaking floors. The voices grew louder as they got closer to the center of the building. Clint's heart was racing, and his mind was focused on one thing: finding the evidence that would take down Ray once and for all. His fingers grazed the edge of a crate as they passed, and for a moment, he thought he heard the sound of footsteps behind them. But when he turned, there was nothing. Just the darkened corners of the warehouse. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Evelyn signaled for him to keep moving, and they reached a small office at the back of the building. The door was ajar, and through the crack, Clint could see a desk, papers scattered across it, a laptop left open. He could feel the tension building with every second they wasted. Evelyn peered inside, then nodded. She pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The room was small, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb. The desk was cluttered, papers strewn everywhere, and Clint's eyes immediately landed on a stack of folders. He stepped forward, scanning the contents. "Clint, over here," Evelyn whispered urgently, her voice tight with tension. He turned to find her standing by the laptop. She was already pulling up a series of encrypted files. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "This is where he's keeping the records of his operations." Clint's heart skipped a beat. They had found it, the key to everything. But just as Evelyn began extracting the data, a noise from outside the room made them freeze. Footsteps, and then the unmistakable sound of a voice. "What the hell are you doing in here?" Clint's blood ran cold. They had been caught. Evelyn's hand flew to her gun, but Clint grabbed her wrist, shaking his head. "We don't have time for this," he whispered. "We need to move." Without a second thought, they bolted for the back exit. But just as they reached the door, a shout rang out from behind them. "Stop!" Clint's pulse quickened. They were being chased. The sound of running footsteps echoed in the warehouse, getting closer with each passing second. Evelyn reached for the door handle, but Clint stopped her. "No, it's too risky. We'll take the back way." They turned, heading toward a narrow hallway that led deeper into the building. The footsteps were closer now, almost on top of them. Clint's mind raced. They couldn't afford to be caught, not after everything they had risked to get this far. Evelyn pulled ahead, her movements swift and precise. Clint followed, but the sound of their pursuers was growing louder. They were close, too close. Just as they reached the end of the hallway, Clint spotted a small door to the left. He grabbed Evelyn's arm, yanking her toward it. They slipped inside just as the first man rounded the corner, missing them by mere seconds. The door shut quietly behind them, and they held their breath, waiting. The footsteps outside grew fainter as the men passed, and Clint allowed himself a moment to exhale. They had made it, barely. Evelyn looked at him, her face pale but determined. "We've got what we came for. Let's get out of here before it gets worse." Clint nodded. They had the evidence. Now it was time to leave before Ray's men could close in on them. As they made their way out of the building, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. They had just uncovered the evidence that would bring Ray's empire crashing down, but it had come at a cost. They were on the run now, with no time to waste. And they had no idea what Ray would do next. The breakthrough has come, but at a dangerous cost. Clint and Evelyn have uncovered crucial evidence that could take down Ray Simmons, but the clock is ticking. As the web tightens around them, they must move quickly if they want to stay one step ahead of Ray's deadly empire. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the city as Clint and Evelyn made their way through the streets. The adrenaline from the night before still surged through Clint's veins, but there was no time to savor their victory. They had what they came for, the irrefutable evidence that would bring Ray Simmons to his knees. But now they had to make sure the world saw it. Clint checked his phone again. Catherine had sent a cryptic message. "It's time. Meet at the drop point." It was vague, but Clint knew what she meant. Everything they had worked for, all the danger they had faced, came down to this moment. They were about to make Ray pay for everything he had done. "Do you think we can trust her?" Evelyn's voice broke the silence between them. Clint glanced over at her. "I don't know, but right now, we don't have a choice. We've pushed too far to back out now." They arrived at the meeting point, an old building near the outskirts of the city, hidden among decaying warehouses. Catherine was already there, waiting for them, her expression unreadable. Behind her, a black SUV was parked, the engine idling as if ready to disappear into the shadows at a moment's notice. "You made it," Catherine said, her voice cool but with an edge that Clint couldn't quite place. Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "We have what we need, but we're running out of time. Ray's going to make his move soon." Catherine nodded, her lips tight. "Ray has already made his move. He knows you're coming for him. This is bigger than just a few illegal businesses. He's got people inside every major institution in this city. It's not going to be easy to take him down." Clint studied Catherine carefully, trying to gauge if she was playing them, but there was something in her eyes that made him trust her, at least for the moment. "What's the plan?" Clint asked. Catherine took a breath and turned to face them fully. "We go public. We release everything, the financial records, the human trafficking network, the evidence of his political influence. I have contacts in the press who will make sure it gets to the right people. But we need to do it before Ray can wipe the evidence clean. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." Clint glanced at Evelyn. She nodded. They had come too far to back out now. This was it, the final step. "All right," Clint said, his voice steady. "Let's do it." As Catherine made the final arrangements to leak the evidence to the press, Clint and Evelyn prepared for the worst. They knew Ray wouldn't go down quietly. There would be retaliation. But they were ready. They had the truth on their side, and that was all that mattered. The sun was fully up now, the light pouring over the city as if signaling the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Suddenly, Clint's phone buzzed. It was a text from an anonymous number. "You think you can expose me? Think again." Clint's blood ran cold. He knew what that meant. Ray was making his move. Without another word, Clint grabbed Evelyn's arm. "We've got to go now." The three of them rushed toward the SUV. Catherine was already behind the wheel, her eyes sharp as she glanced over her shoulder. "We need to move fast. Ray's men are already on their way." The engine roared to life as Catherine sped through the streets, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Clint could feel the tension in the air. Ray wasn't going to let this happen without a fight. "Where are we going?" Evelyn asked, her voice urgent. "To the drop point," Catherine said, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I have a safe house there. We'll lay low and make sure the evidence gets out before Ray can find us." Clint looked out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur. He had no idea what would happen next, no idea if they were even going to make it out alive. But he knew one thing for sure. Ray Simmons was done. As they pulled into the safe house, Clint could feel the weight of the moment. They had exposed Ray's empire, and now there was no turning back. The world would know the truth, but that truth came at a steep price. Catherine parked the SUV in the garage, and the three of them rushed inside. Evelyn immediately got to work, preparing the evidence for release. Catherine stood guard by the door, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of danger. Clint kept an eye on the time. Every second counted now. And then, just as they were about to send the information to the press, the sound of footsteps came from outside. "Get down," Catherine hissed. The three of them dove to the floor just as gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks of bullets tearing through the walls. Clint's heart raced, and he scrambled to get to his feet, reaching for his own weapon. Ray's men had found them. The fight was on. Clint and Evelyn dove behind a row of crates for cover, their guns drawn as they fired back at the attackers. Catherine, ever the strategist, quickly moved to a more advantageous position, firing with deadly precision. It was chaos. Ray's men were everywhere, their footsteps echoing through the house as they tried to close in on the trio. Clint's pulse was pounding in his ears as he fired another shot, taking down one of Ray's men. But just as the battle seemed to settle, Clint's phone buzzed again. It was another text. "This is the end." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up. Ray's men were too many, and they were closing in fast. But Clint wasn't about to give up now. With a fierce look in his eyes, he turned to Catherine. "We can't stop here. We finish this now." Catherine nodded, her jaw clenched. "Let's end this." Together, they pushed forward, taking down Ray's men one by one. The fight was brutal, but as the dust began to settle, Clint knew they had made it through. Ray's empire was crumbling, and his reign of terror was over. As the news spread across the city, the authorities began to take action, arresting Ray and his top associates. The evidence Clint and his team had uncovered was enough to bring down the entire operation. And as for Clint, Evelyn, and Catherine, their work was done. They had faced the darkness and come out on top. Ray Simmons was finished. The world knew the truth, and justice had been served. Clint looked around at his team, his family, now more than ever. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about the bond they had formed through the chaos, the trust that had carried them through the storm. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?